For decades, the American middle class has symbolized stability, hard work, and the promise of a better life. But today, that promise is fading fast. A growing number of Americans, people who work full-time jobs, raise families, and pay taxes, are now staring down a terrifying reality: homelessness. This isn't just a crisis of poverty anymore. It's a crisis creeping into the living rooms of middle-class homes. Rising costs, stagnant wages, and one unexpected emergency can send an average household into a downward spiral. For many, it's no longer a question of if they'll struggle to pay rent, but when. The middle class is crumbling. Wages have barely budged over the last few decades, but the cost of living has exploded. From groceries to gas, healthcare to housing, Americans are paying more for everything while earning relatively the same. And inflation? It's just making things worse. Since the 1990s, the U.S. dollar has lost over 80% of its purchasing power. That means your paycheck doesn't stretch nearly as far as it used to. And when everyday essentials cost more, there's less room for emergencies, less room to breathe. Today, nearly 60% of middle-class households have less than $1,000 in savings. Think about that. One car repair, one medical bill, one layoff, and it could all unravel. Renting into ruin. Homeownership was once the hallmark of the middle class. But now, even that dream is slipping away. Nearly 43 million American households are renters, a record high. Even more startling, a massive increase in renters who make between $56,000 and $100,000 a year. In just 5 years, that group has grown by 86%. They aren't renting by choice. They're renting because they've been priced out of buying homes. And even renting isn't what it used to be. Rental vacancies are the lowest they've been since 1985. Renters are competing for fewer units and paying more than ever. On average, annual rent has jumped by more than $1,150 since 2022. Meanwhile, middle-class incomes have dropped 9% in the last decade when adjusted for inflation. One middle-class American living this nightmare is Robert Gary, a salesman in Columbus, Ohio. The pandemic shook his finances, and when his landlord announced a $250 rent increase, pushing his rent to nearly $2,000 a month, it became unsustainable. Despite working full-time and getting raises, the math just doesn't work anymore. Half his paycheck now goes to rent. "I'm living paycheck to paycheck and barely making it," Robert says. Eventually, he had to move in with a friend. His story is far from unique. It's the new reality for millions. Housing is eating the middle class alive. Middle-class families are being crushed by housing costs. Nearly half of all middle-class renters spend more than 30% of their income on housing. A significant number spend over 50%, placing them in the severely burdened category. These aren't people living lavishly. They're just trying to keep the lights on and forget buying a home. Over 70% of houses in the U.S. are now out of reach for first-time buyers with middle-class incomes. Rising interest rates have only made things worse. In many cities, you now need an income of over $120,000 a year just to rent a median apartment. Let's put that into perspective. In Boston, the median rent is about $2,780. To afford that under standard guidelines, a household needs to earn at least $127,000 a year. But essential workers like teachers and nurses, people we depend on, earn far less than that. They're being priced out of the very cities they serve. Everyone's competing for the same space. The forces driving this crisis are complex, and they're colliding. Millennials saddled with student loans can't afford homes. Retiring baby boomers are downsizing and competing for apartments. People who lost homes during past recessions are still in the rental market. And tight lending practices make mortgages harder to get. It all adds up to one thing: too many people chasing too few affordable homes. The result? A rental market under extreme pressure, and a middle class hanging by a thread. Even good jobs aren't enough. You'd think a six-figure salary would provide stability. Not anymore. In cities like San Francisco, the upfront cost of renting an apartment can exceed $12,000 just to move in, and that doesn't include monthly rent. According to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, you need to earn at least $21.21 an hour to afford a modest two-bedroom apartment. But the average U.S. wage is just $16.38 an hour. There's a growing group known as the missing middle. People who earn too much to qualify for housing assistance, but not enough to afford market-rate housing. They're stuck in limbo. Too rich for help, too poor to survive comfortably. Michelle Dickerson, a housing expert at the University of Texas, puts it bluntly. A family making $100,000 can't afford to buy a house in most U.S. cities. Some analysts now say it takes close to $300,000 a year to raise a middle-class family without financial stress. The real cost of survival. What happens when housing eats half your income? You sacrifice, and not just luxury items, but food, healthcare, and savings. A study by Apartment List found that cost-burdened renters spend 41% less on food and 74% less on healthcare than households that aren't burdened. That means middle-class families are skipping meals, postponing doctor visits, and ignoring car repairs just to make rent. Across America, 51 million households can't afford a basic monthly budget that covers essentials like housing, food, childcare, and transportation. That number isn't just a statistic. It's a red flag, a signal that the middle class is being hollowed out. A chain reaction of instability. The lack of affordable housing is creating ripple effects across the economy. When lower-income families are pushed out of affordable units, they move into homes that were once for the middle class. And middle-class families, already struggling, slide further down the economic ladder. Kim Bencourt-Fanny May says it's a chain reaction that threatens the entire system. And Sydney Bennett of Apartment List warns that we're moving towards a society where only the wealthy can own homes, while everyone else is stuck renting or worse. The invisible crisis. Perhaps the most devastating part of this crisis? It's largely invisible. Middle-class families often don't qualify for government help. Programs like food stamps and housing assistance are aimed at the poorest Americans, leaving those just above the poverty line with no safety net. Take Mark and Lisa, for example. They both had decent jobs and lived within their means. But when Mark was laid off, they quickly burned through their savings. Health care costs and rising bills pushed them over the edge. They didn't qualify for assistance, and within months, they lost their home. Or consider David, a factory worker with over 20 years on the job. He hadn't had a real raise in years. When the plant downsized, he lost his job and couldn't keep up with his mortgage. Now, his family lives in temporary housing, unsure of what comes next. These are not isolated cases. They are a preview of what's to come if nothing changes. The road ahead. The American dream is slipping out of reach for millions, not because they failed, but because the system around them is breaking down. Housing, once a pathway to stability, has become a trapdoor. If we ignore this growing crisis, the consequences will be profound. More families will fall into homelessness. More children will grow up without stability. And the economic foundation of the nation will continue to crack. This isn't just a housing crisis, it's a warning. The cost of inaction will be greater than any policy change or investment in affordable housing. The time to act is now, before the middle class becomes a memory.